Hey folks, this is a big picture, maybe even like a Google Earth view of a period of history known as the Middle Ages. We're going to look at Europe's history after the fall of Rome and give it some global perspective. So the title of this presentation is The Decline and Recovery of Western Civilization, meaning that in the fall of Rome, Western civilization really didn't appear to be poised for any great peace in future history. But by 1900, the heirs of Western civilization, talking primarily the cultures of Europe and of America by extension, would be dominating much of the world. And that's a picture that didn't seem apparent if you go back to the early time of, say, 500 CE. Now, you want to pay particular attention to this. We have a quiz coming up after this presentation is done, so it might take us two screencasts to get it all in. So please pay attention to this. Here's some things we will need to understand for this presentation. Between 1500 and 1900, that is like right around the time of Columbus to the turn of the 20th century, the civilization that descended from classical Rome would dominate most of the world. And that's meaning that the civilizations from Western Europe and from America are going to be really the most powerful players around the world. Number two, the effects of this domination are still very much present today in the economic and political patterns of the world. We'll see that even today we'll see the power of Western civilization in places far outside of its primary reach. Three, this domination would have seemed surprising to observers following the decline of the Roman's Western Empire. The collapse of Roman's empire left Europe desperately weak and divided compared to other civilizations of Afro-Eurasia. Essentially, Europe was on the periphery of Afro-Eurasia and was a basket case at the close of the Roman Empire around 500 CE. It didn't seem to appear to be the place that would be really dominating the world, and we'll look at that. The period between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and recovery of Europe in the Renaissance, beginning around 1350 CE, is called the Middle Ages. Okay, so we'll take a look at that. So we kind of fragment this here. So point one is between 1500 and 1900, the civilizations that descended from classical Rome would dominate most of the world. I have a political cartoon there that dates from the late 19th century, and there are kind of archetypes or stereotypes seated around the pie, which is being carved in pieces, which is a French cartoon, so that's the word China right there, the country of China. The Chinese man in the back, drawn as a kind of a stereotypical Chinese with his long fingernails, his cute hair, is outraged by the fact he's not at the table when his piece of pie is being carved up. The Western powers, along with Japan, which is pictured on the far right, were really poised to dominate and take over China by the late 19th century. China was historically the most powerful nation on earth, and it's emerging into that place. We're trying to return to what it's considered rightful place right now. But at the end of the 19th century, the English, pictured there by a picture of the Queen, the Germans, with a picture there of the Kaiser. Next to him would be the Russian, and behind him, the French woman and the Japanese guy in the corner are contemplating on how to carve up China, once the most powerful state in the world. And that's what we're going to look at. How did the Europeans get to the point to be able to do this? Okay, so Western civilization's emerging domination of the world. So that's what we're looking at. Western civilizations, and perhaps I should have apostrophe there, dominating of the world. Beginning in 1500, Europe's interest in trade and expansion would lead to voyages of discovery that, by 1500, connected Europe to the Americas, which the Europeans would call New World. We try to avoid using the word New World a lot because it certainly is a Eurocentric idea that the Americas were not a new world to the people who lived there. And indeed, Columbus did not discover the Americas. Humans had been there for a long time. But anyhow, we'll refer to those as the Americas, and sometimes we kind of slip into that older idea of calling it the New World. The Europeans would soon come to dominate these lands, and they would become extensions of Western civilization. In the North America, particularly in the United States and Canada, the French and the British are going to be dominating. And from Mexico in through South America, you're going to see the Portuguese and the Spanish. They are all descendants of Western civilization. They are all using the Roman alphabet, Christianity, and all the other aspects of Western civilization we talked about. Now, in the Caribbean, it gets a little mixed up. We see the French and the Dutch and the Spanish to a certain degree in the Caribbean too. But that's going to be the idea that Europe, which was once a pretty obscure and small place, is going to have access of this wealth. So they eventually come to dominate this area, and they would begin to import slave labor from Africa by purchasing slaves from African states and exporting those slaves to create wealth. And every step of the way, we're going to find out later on, the Europeans were making wealth. And that wealth, of course, gave Europe the power to invest in stronger navies and eventually into technology. By 1750, ideas of the Industrial Revolution were supported by science and by emerging forms of business would allow European states to develop increasingly more efficient economies with more sophisticated technology. You add all that together and you end up with a recipe for world domination. You have, instead of wooden sailed navies, by the end of the 19th century, we have steam powered steel navies. Instead of a cannon that could shoot one ball, we have the Maxim gun, which could shoot hundreds of rounds a minute. All this new technology gave the Europeans, and America by extension, the power to extend their sovereignty and power over other peoples. You studied that in American history, but it's becoming a global issue. And by 1900, the empires of Western civilization would dominate the world. And of course, that's near the time we are right now. And these things are still pretty much evident today. So my second point is the effects of this domination, which we point out to 1900, are still very much present today in the economic and political patterns of the world. I like that picture. It's a striking picture of what is sometimes called McDonaldization or Coca-Colonization, is that Western models and tastes and economic patterns seem to be irresistible. And in many cases, like we talked about 9/11, Al Qaeda would attack America in part because some societies and people within societies feel like West modernization is Westernization and that traditional patterns are being overwhelmed by it. I like the picture of this appears to be either in China or in Japan. You can see the Far Eastern architecture there with the McDonald's sign right in front of it. You know what? I'm looking at that sign. It could be actually be Korea. The architecture is all somewhat similar, but I believe that that writing is Korean. Okay, so how is this an impact today? The impact of Western civilization's global dominance is still with us today, and it should be global. Western domination of the world began to decline after World War I, and it would speed up after World War II. Europe had once had huge control over great parts of the world. They lost that part, lost a lot of that domination after World War II. But we could see that these states lost control of colonies around the world, and America and the Soviet Union would inherit the idea of global domination after 1945. But one thing we could still see in today's world is Western societies continue to support some of the highest levels of human development, meaning that people living in societies that are Western in their tradition and Western in their birth, generally speaking, have more freedom. They have better health, and they're more connected through technology than citizens of non-Western societies. Although this gap has been being reduced since 1970, as some of the poorer countries begin to narrow the gap between the rich and poor. So you take a look and you see the top 10 countries are dominated by societies, all except Japan, using a Roman alphabet. All of those societies being very heavily influenced by the Western model of civilization, even Japan by extension. The poorest countries are countries that share, I guess, the misfortune of being dominated by the West for a period of time. Their economic development is very slow. Life in those countries is very desperate, relatively poor. Ethiopia has been rising, although they're in the midst of a possible civil war, which would not be good for a country that's trying to emerge out of poverty. But these countries are generally plagued by civil war, um, plagues, epidemics, and these all too could be explained by domination from Europe and how those countries have been used in the recent hit and prepared for independence. Now, why is this? This is an issue here is how is it that Western civilizations could dominate the rest? And you see a picture there of the Western ideas of civilization. Notice the classical kind of depiction of liberty there as she's raising her shield against, on the right, barbarism. Notice that the barbarians are darker skinned than the white people who are fighting with their guns against the spears and arrows of the barbarians. So we explain this often in many ways. Racism. The racist idea of the rise of the West is that white people simply were more intelligent and built stronger societies. Now, of course, that would be an idea that in some pseudoscience was supported, and of course, Adolf Hitler lived and died on this idea of the science of racial superiority. Historians and biologists see this as a fallacy, and racism, though, and racist nationalism endures in the United States, among other places. Another is a Christian argument. The argument here goes somewhere like this, that the Christian God favors Western Christians, although there's no empirical way to prove God's favor. God exists beyond the idea of science. We see many of the poorest nations on earth have accepted Christianity, yet some of those nations I showed you on the list have Christian majorities, yet there's no corresponding increase of wealth when a country becomes Christian. Some saw it as the supremacy of their own unique Western culture. The Germans felt that it was their civilizing mission. The French and the British felt the same sense of pride. But we know that that sense of nationalist pride led to two catastrophic wars, and they all came out as losers. And then cultures on the fringe of Western society, that is America, which inherited Western civilization as a transplant from Europe, and the Soviets, who live on the eastern fringes of the Western world, have inherited global dominance. So the real answer, how do you really explain the rise of the West? Well, wait for it. It's, of course, going to be in the answer of history. So point 3 is we'll leave our first part of the presentation. The collapse of the Roman Empire had left the powerful Europe civilization desperately weak and divided compared to other civilizations in Afro-Eurasia. When we say Afro-Eurasia, again, that's a term for the old world, meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia. So we know that when Rome collapsed in the West was shattered. The collapse of the Roman Empire shattered the order and interdependence of Western civilization. Trade essentially stopped. The seas were unsafe. The roads were not safe. There was no government order that could really guarantee the travel of people. And even if there was, the cities were in such decline, there was no really much concentration of wealth that could demand trade. Cities like Rome, that once had over 1 million people living in at the height of the Roman Empire, were now smaller than the city of Erie is today. And most people lived in rural countrysides. The cities were unsafe. They could not be protected. No government or interdependent order could do that. Government, generally speaking, this time is local, based on personal relationships. Somebody local who has some authority and could you promise your obedience, almost like to be enslaved to that person, and that person would extract wealth and use part of his wealth to control and protect you. Something on the order of the size of a township or a county. Larger scale governments did not sustain very long. The Roman Church protected what were the remnants of Western Roman civilization, like literacy, writing, learning. But most people of Europe lived lives of desperate poverty and ignorance. Even to the Christians, they were riddled by superstitions that indicated how they saw the world. The year from 500 to 1000 in Europe is often known as the Dark Ages, and that testifies to the desperate poverty of that period. Meanwhile, in the eastern part of the empire, the Byzantine society declined at a relatively slower pace, and it was under the assault of Arabs, Persians, and later Turkish attacks that would conquer it. Western civilization was really slow out of the gates in 500 CE and seemed very far behind other societies. The second half of this presentation will finish. Okay, come back to us.